Jewish Education in Media is pleased to present L'Chaim, a program that highlights the people, issues, and events of importance to the Jewish community. Now here is your host, Rabbi Mark Golub.
I'm Mark Golub. It's amazing to meet someone who is especially talented in a given area and sphere of life. Talented people are always most impressive. But when you meet someone who's an absolute star in two areas of life, well, that's extraordinary, most unusual. And that's the good fortune we have on this edition of L'Chaim, as I have the honor of being joined by Elie Abadie, who on the one hand is a highly regarded gastroenterologist with a private practice in Manhattan, having done his residency and fellowship at Maimonides Hospital. And on the other hand, alongside his active medical practice, Elie Abadie is one of the most learned, creative, and charismatic rabbis on the American Jewish scene today. Elie Abadie, who currently serves as director of the Jacob E. Safra Institute of Sephardic Studies at Yeshiva University, where he received his smicha in 1986. Elie Abadie became a rabbinic star as the founding rabbi of the Orthodox Sephardic Safra Synagogue in New York, named after the late philanthropist Edmund J. Safra, who financed the congregation in 2003. And under Elie Abadie's dynamic leadership, the Safra Synagogue grew both in size and in stature to become one of the most prestigious synagogues in New York and one of the outstanding Sephardic synagogues in all of America. And then controversy raised its ugly head, and Edmund Safra's widow Lily, in essence and to the shock of everyone, fired Elie Abadie. Things devolved into a Jewish soap opera. The Jewish Week reported that Elie Abadie was receiving $700,000 a year in salary, was living in a congregational apartment worth $3 million. And after being told his contract with the synagogue would not be renewed, the report is he demanded a severance package of $20 million. Not surprisingly, Elie Abadie has disputed much of the tabloid reportage surrounding his leaving the Safra Synagogue. But what's not in dispute is the enormity of impact Elie's had while serving his congregation. Many of you know Eli Kohanim from JBS here, whose long history at the Safra Synagogue is well known. Here's how Elie describes Rabbi Elie Abadie: as the heart and soul of the congregation, which would otherwise be just a building. He's a rabbinic leader who's gained recognition for the Sephardic traditions in the broader Jewish community, and he has championed issues of justice for Jewish refugees from Muslim and Arab countries. It is just thrilling for me to have you at this table. I've been so looking forward to sitting here with you. Thank you for making the trip out here to sit with me and to join us here on JBS.
Thank you very much, Mark. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
So when you came here, Elie, you come from some kind of Jewish work or some kind of medical work?
Today?
Today.
Today I came from a Jewish work.
Today you're Jewish work. How often do you practice as a gastroenterologist? How many days a week?
I practice 2 days in my office, but of course if there's any emergency, emergency there doesn't decide what day the emergency to come, so I attend to that too.
Okay. You know, I'm sure you asked this 1,000 times. It's hard enough to be a rabbi. How can a human being be both a rabbi and a practicing doctor and do both of them well?
Well, I guess, it depends on who is judging. But
Everybody judges. You do both very well.
thank God. Thank you, and thank God for the compliment.
And people, there's a joke out here. The joke is, when you meet Rabbi Abadie, the first thing you ask him is about acid reflux.
That's correct.
Okay, so anyway, Elie, how do you do both?
So I was raised to always live the life of our ancestors, and especially the Sephardic ancestors and even the Talmudic rabbis. They all had the rabbinic sphere of influence, of knowledge, and of expertise, and yet at the same time they had their secular sphere of knowledge and expertise.
Absolutely.
And so I follow in their footsteps.
Consciously?
Consciously.
You made that conscious decision.
I made that conscious decision. I was raised with that conscious decision by my family.
All right, we'll come to that in a moment. But you received smicha in 1986. You ultimately go on to study medical school, and then you're at Montefiore, correct?
At Maimonides.
Maimonides, yes. But the rabbinic smicha preceded the work at Maimonides.
Correct.
Okay. Is that also sequential for you? Did you become a rabbi first and then a doctor? When I mean sequential, is that your thinking?
No. As a child, I always wanted to be a doctor. Always wanted to be a doctor. My father was a rabbi. I come from a tradition of rabbis, if not every generation, every other generation, going back for 500 years or so, all the way to Spain. And so that was inculcated, if you will, in my genes, in the way I was raised. And we always believed, my father, alav shalom, always believed in that, and my family, that we always have to serve God, and at the same time we have to have a profession that serves humanity.
That is lovely.
And as you know, Maimonides is one of the many, actually, though one of the most famous ones, but he was one of the many Sephardic rabbis in Spain who was a rabbi and a doctor and a philosopher and many other things.
Yes. So the reality is you are following in the great Rambam's model, but it's interesting for me to hear that this is something that was an orientation you had from childhood, and in some way it sounds like it came from your mother and father. Who are your... Boy, I know a little bit about you, having read about you and having heard people talk about you. I know you were born in Lebanon, and you ultimately go to Mexico City.
Correct.
And that's where you are raised, correct?
Correct.
So how many siblings do you have?
We are 6 in total.
6. Where are you in the 6?
I am the youngest.
You're the youngest.
Correct.
Okay. Your mother and father, who were they?
My father was a rabbi of a community all the way in Lebanon. He was born in Aleppo, Syria. My mother also was born in Aleppo, Syria.
What was his name?
Abraham.
Abraham. And your mother's name?
Fortuné.
Fortuné.
Yeah, Fortuné.
So Abraham. Okay. And when they raised you in Mexico City, you and the other 5 siblings, you said he was a rabbi. That still doesn't talk about the texture of your Jewish home. What was the texture of your Jewish life growing up in Mexico City?
Well, I can remember even in Lebanon, because I left Lebanon at age 10. And so my father himself was an accountant, was a rabbi, was a shohet, was a mohel, was a sofer, and was a hazan. He really fulfilled all the 5 different aspects of the rabbinate,
yes,
which was also the Sephardic tradition of rabbis.
Yes.
And learning from him, he was an accountant, he was a principal of a school, and then a rabbi. And basically, he raised me believing in Torah im melacha or Torah im derech eretz.
Work and respecting other human beings.
Correct.
Very, very good. There are many American Ashkenazic Jews who've had little or no experience with Sephardic traditions. And the way it's described often is that in the Sephardic tradition, it's virtually a form of orthodoxy, that you don't normally have Reform Sephardic synagogues or conservative Sephardic synagogues. Is that fair to say?
That is fair to say, and that reminds me of a tour of a reform group that came to visit the synagogue.
Which one? Safra?
Correct.
Yes.
And they asked me, so are you Orthodox, conservative, or Reform? I said, no, we are Sephardic. They said, well, we know that, but what are you, Orthodox? And kept on answering Sephardic until they understood that Sephardic, it's its own genre, so to speak.
Yes.
That it's not Orthodox, it's not conservative, and it's not Reform.
Okay.
It's traditional to the way that in synagogue and in public life, tradition is followed, which you may call it orthodox. But in private life, people are given that freedom to choose what level of observance they have.
Okay. Help me understand this a little bit more for our viewers. When you talk to an Ashkenazic Orthodox rabbi, they're talking about halakha. And they will argue that they are living a life of Talmudic halakha. And that from their perspective, it's Sinai. It comes from Mount Sinai. God's self gave not only the written Torah, the 5 books of Moses, he gave the oral tradition, which explains how the Torah is to be lived in actual life. What's the Sephardic concomitant to that? To what extent would a Sephardic rabbi like yourself say you are committed to Talmudic halakha?
Well, Sephardic Jews and Sephardic tradition is that Torah was Sinai.
Yes.
And it was given to the sages and to the leaders, and it was developed in the Talmud and the Mishnah, and then of course several rabbis after that. I think the only difference between maybe Sephardic rabbis and Ashkenazic rabbinic leadership is that Sephardic rabbis try to adapt modern life to Jewish tradition, or Jewish tradition to modern life. We are able to see the modernity of situation, that what's happening nowadays, and be able, how can we apply this Talmudic halakha, which really is more than just Talmudic, because there are the Rishonim, the early rabbis, the commentators, the Geonim also. And so there's a tradition that after Talmud, there's 2,000 years almost, post-Talmudic halakha that was developed and adapted to the situation and the circumstances of that time.
Yes.
And so Sephardi rabbis are much more attuned, if I may say, to be able to take that halakha and apply it in a way that it is palatable, that is acceptable, yet without breaking with tradition.
Okay, you've got to now give our audience some examples. And imagine I would have sitting next to you an Ashkenazic Orthodox rabbi, hearing what you say, and I'll tell you what I heard you say. You said that you believe that within the Sephardic tradition, where the word Orthodox really doesn't apply, you consider yourself to be essentially a Jew out of a tradition that comes from Sinai. And the Talmud is part of it, and as you say, all the commentaries are part of it, but that you understand it to be a developing, evolving Jewish tradition. How do you think an Orthodox rabbi from an Ashkenazic synagogue would disagree with you? Where would the different emphasis be? And can you give us an example of something you, as a Sephardic rabbi, would be willing to either do or teach within your understanding of halakha, and you know that there are Ashkenazic Orthodox rabbis who would be uncomfortable with what you would be saying?
Well, if I may say, maybe modern Orthodoxy would be the closest to Sephardic Judaism, but I cannot say Sephardic Jews are modern Orthodox. Example, and we have seen that through Rabbi Ovadia Yosef's many of his responsa.
Chief Rabbi
of Israel, the former Sephardic Chief Rabbi of Israel, the Rishon LeZion, and many of his responsa, you see the difference between his approach and the Ashkenazi rabbis.
Give us an example.
I'll give you just a very, very simple example.
Yes.
Somebody who does not keep Shabbat, or
Yes.
somebody who does not keep kosher, come to synagogue, and he drives to synagogue. We don't have parking lots open. But they drive and they park wherever they want to park. They come into the synagogue, they sit and they pray, and they would like an aliyah to the Torah. We give them one. Even if they don't ask for one, we invite them to get an aliyah. And if he happens to be a Kohen, we also let him do the blessing of the priest, although Ashkenazi minhag don't do that outside Israel, but we do it on a daily basis. And so we allow that person to participate in the ritual of the synagogue without stopping him. Where most likely in an Orthodox Ashkenazi synagogue, somebody like that, they will not give them an aliyah, or they will not allow them to do Birkat Kohanim, if they were Kohanim.
I want to say this very gently. I am not in your league in terms of scholarship, especially within the Sephardic tradition. There are many Orthodox synagogues which do not have a police halachic police outside the synagogue who tell people inside, Chaim here just got out of his car and walked into the synagogue. He is not Shomer Shabbat. And that's what we're talking about. Shomer Shabbat means that a Jew is observing the Shabbat according to halakha to the extent to which it's possible. So Ashkenazic synagogues, as far as I've never once, and I'm not now talking about a Riskin synagogue or Avi Wife synagogue, I'm talking about Ashkenazic Orthodox synagogues. There's no Ashkenazic police standing outside telling somebody inside, don't give that person an aliyah. And I know that there are Jews in Orthodox synagogues who are not only far less than observant in their personal lives. If you ask them, is there a test? And I'm curious to know what you would say about this anyway. Do you believe in God or not? It would never, no Orthodox synagogue ever asks that of a human being. And whether a person believes in God, doesn't believe in God, they're still given an aliyah where they're saying, Notein HaTorah from God. So I say to you gently, while you give me the example, and we know that Sephardic synagogues are much more embracing of Jews who are not halachically oriented in their private lives. Everybody understands that. I don't think that's an example of where an Ashkenazic synagogue is different than yours, even a Young Israel synagogue or a Gouda.
I have to disagree a bit with you.
All right.
Because usually an Orthodox Ashkenazi synagogue is very monolithic in its attendance. Almost everybody knows who that person is. A person who is not known usually will not get an aliyah in that synagogue.
Okay, suppose he is known, and he's known, at one point.
If he's known and he's known that he's not, most likely
he's not Shomer Shabbat.
Probably they will not give him an aliyah. That's what I have
that's what you've experienced?
Experienced and seen.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see if any of our viewers write us about this.
Of course, there are many other examples that
give me another example. Give me an example
that we can give. Here is an example that yesterday I was discussing with some of my Sephardic rabbis. Somebody who does not keep kosher outside his home and does not keep Shabbat, and is inviting a friend of his who eats only strictly kosher food into his house to eat. The question, do you trust that person that is going to give a kosher food, even though he himself doesn't keep kosher, even though he doesn't keep Shabbat? And our conclusion was, yes, you do trust them, if he is Sephardic. Why?
I want to make sure our audience understands. You have a Jew who observes kashrut visiting a Sephardic home where kashrut is not observed?
It's not observed outside the home.
Outside the home.
Where the host claims that outside the home he does not keep kosher, but at home he does keep kosher.
Okay. And you're saying that within the Sephardic tradition, the Jew who observes kashrut in his home but might not observe kashrut outside the home. And let me just understand again. It's so fascinating, Elie. There's biblical kashrut and rabbinic kashrut. So biblical kashrut prohibits certain foods as treif. Rabbinic kashrut adds a level above that that says not only if you're going to eat a permitted food, it has to be slaughtered in a certain way and prepared in a certain way. There are some Jews who will not eat treif. They'll never have shrimp or lobster, but they'll eat a steak in a non-Orthodox, non-kosher restaurant.
Correct.
Are we talking about a Jew in a Sephardic home who observes kashrut in the home, but eats treif outside the home?
But he may not eat shrimp or pig or anything like that.
He does. Is it still within the Sephardic tradition?
He could.
He could.
He could. That's correct.
But my guess is you are really referring to somebody who eats a permitted food, lamb, steak, whatever, but it's not in a kosher restaurant.
It's not a kosher restaurant.
Okay. And that, of course, is not keeping.
It's not considered kosher food.
And you're saying here comes a Sephardic Jew who does keep kosher. He's coming into the home, and the question is, will the Jew who's entering the home be willing to trust that the Sephardic Jew in his own home, for those who will give him only properly prepared kosher food.
Separation of
Yes.
meat and milk and
Yes.
everything.
And just so our audience understands, this is a much better example from my perspective, because in most Ashkenazic Orthodox contexts, that person the Jew who is observant of kashrut in Nata wouldn't even go into that home to eat.
Correct.
You're saying in the Sephardic tradition, he would,
He would.
and he wouldn't ask questions.
He would be comfortable eating, and the reason for it is that this Jew who eats kosher in his home but does not eat kosher outside has made that separation in which at home we're going to keep kosher food. Outside we're going to do whatever our culinary art feels to do. And so therefore that person is trustworthy because that person understands the requirements of kashrut in his home and therefore will not feed his guests who is very meticulous about kashrut something that is not kosher. Mm-hmm. And therefore he is trustworthy.
Mm-hmm. Now, what happens when somebody says to you, oh, Elie, you're a conservative Jew? Conservative Jews are theoretically committed to halakha, whether individual conservative families do or do not. Shomer Shabbat is not the issue. As a movement, the conservative movement is committed to halakha, and yet it understands that conservative Jews have a range of practice, and more so, they have a different philosophy about halakha and how the halakha is both historically binding, and at the same time, the conservative community within the structure of the Jewish Theological Seminary's Committee on Law and Standards can make changes so that if the conservative movement decides that from now on it is acceptable to drive to services, then it becomes acceptable, and theoretically you drive to services and don't drive anywhere else, which is a problem in and of itself.
So
how is it different?
So here's the difference. The difference is that Sephardic Jews do not change Rabbinic Judaism. Certainly not biblical, and they will not change Rabbinic Judaism. They will adapt it, but they will never change it. Where conservative Jews, as you mentioned, they will be willing to abrogate certain rabbinic dictums, rabbinic halakha, to fit their modern life, where Sephardic Jews, they don't. Even that Sephardic Jew who may not keep kasher, may not keep Shabbat, he believes in God most of the time. He believes that the Torah is divine. He believes in the rabbinic enactments. And he believes that this is the law. But he also believes that personally he may not be able to follow all of it. So he will follow whatever is, if not just convenient, but palatable to him, acceptable to him, and he believes that maybe later on in life he will follow it much more closer, or his children will do so. So there is no difference in emunah, in faith. A Sephardic Jew, even the non-observant one, have that faith. I would say, I cannot say 100%, but over 99% of Sephardic Jews will have that faith.
I'm going to use
but they may not be observant.
I understand. I'm going to use the word commitment rather than faith.
Okay.
And we'll talk about faith maybe if we have time later on. But you describe it very, very well. It also sounds, Elie, very embracing of the individual Jew. You know, there are many Jews who grew up thinking that Orthodoxy was all about no. It sounds to me as if Sephardic Judaism is a much more yes approach to halakha. And that may be unfair for me to say, but I'm just reacting to what you're saying. To what extent do you think I'm right?
You're very right, I have to say, because that is correct. When somebody comes to ask me a question, I will, most of the time is yes, but, and then I'll give them certain ways of coming to that yes, and then that is palatable to them. And in a sense, we try to keep them within the confines of rabbinic halakha, of biblical halakha, of course, but in a way that it is that person is able to apply to their daily life.
Okay.
What we believe strongly, and that's what Rabbi Ovadia Yosef and many of the Sephardic poskim for centuries, kohad de hetera adif, the power of permissibility is preferred than the power of forbidding things. Because we believe to forbid something, you need not to be a hacham, you need not to be a wise or a sage. Everybody can tell you, no, you're prohibited to do this, you're prohibited to do that. The wisdom is to find a way to permit something within the confines of halakha, of biblical halakha and rabbinic halakha, of course, and of all the commentators. That is, I think, the wisdom of Sephardic rabbis.
Lovely.
I have to say that many of the Ashkenazi rabbis of the previous centuries had that also inclination, maybe not as much as the Sephardic rabbis, where they understood how to face challenges, modern challenges of their time, and apply halakha in a way that it is livable, so to speak. Yet the Ashkenazi rabbis of this century, if I may say, I have found them to be much more rigid in that interpretation.
Why do you think that is? What happened?
I'm not exactly sure, but I ask myself, I think the idea has become more of a social thing that let's see who can be much more mahmir, much more strict and stringent, instead of who can be wise enough to be able to find a permissible way to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you another example,
Please.
if I may.
Yes.
You know, the Kohanim, as they do the priestly blessing, they must remove their shoes before they do it. The Talmudic halakha says that if a Kohen ascends to the bima, right, to the duchan, to the platform, then he must remove his shoes. The reason, the Talmudic reason, was because it was respect for the public, for the kahal, because they were wearing sandals that were dirty and so on and so forth. They had to wash their feet. Now in the Sephardic congregation, almost nobody removes their shoes. Few of them do. Now, many of those priestly blessings are not done on top of the duchan, but are done on a regular, same floor level as the rest of the congregation. And so Sephardic rabbis permitted that they can do it without removing the shoes, for several reasons. Reason number one, Talmudic halakha says strictly a Kohen who ascends to the platform. These Kohanim are not ascending any platform. And so therefore we say that the rabbinic dictum applies only to those Kohanim that ascend. And nowadays that certainly people are not wearing any more sandals, and sometimes it's much more disrespectful to remove one's shoes and see the status of the socks of that person, and so we allow them to keep the shoes.
Are you a Kohen?
I'm not a Kohen.
Okay. What about women and how Sephardic Judaism deals with the issues that are so volatile in the American Jewish community about what is the appropriate way for women to participate in synagogue life? Would a woman be called to the Torah and receive an aliyah? Would there be a woman who becomes an actual rabbi with smicha? Would a woman be a chazan? Could a woman be the president of a Sephardic congregation? In general, talk for a moment about how the Sephardic community has dealt with the issue of women's role and women's rights within traditional Judaism.
Right. So it's interesting to note that the consensus among Sephardic women, those members of the congregation, is that they're not really desirous to take part in such a way in services and prayers. They feel getting an aliyah or being a chazan, it would be imitating the men. They believe that there is a certain way for women to worship God and to participate in prayers that does not have to be by imitating man's role. They understand how they want to connect to God. They themselves do not ask to participate. In fact, if we ask them to participate, they will say, no, I have my way of connecting with God than having to be a chazanit or having to be a Baal Koreh or to read the Torah or or to lead the services. So the consensus among Sephardic women is that that's not our way of connecting with God. We have our own way. We pray either from the Siddur or we have our own prayer to formulate. And so we have not yet faced that challenge, although we might be facing it in the near future, in which we probably, our sages will have to address it.
Okay. People say that the most difficult halachic social issue confronting Orthodox life is the aguna. The aguna is a woman who, for one of various reasons, has not received a bill of divorce, a get, from her husband, either because he refuses to give it to her, or he may even be deceased without having given her one, and there's no proof that he has passed away, and therefore, if there's no proof, she remains an aguna as well. But the more common argument is there's a woman who wants a divorce, and her husband's not even living with her, and her husband maybe even has gone off to a different country and has a different wife. In the Jewish tradition, a man may do that. A woman, however, cannot remarry unless she has a get. So she is called a bound woman, an aguna. And within the Ashkenazic Orthodox community, there is no social issue that is more explosive than that, because as you and I sit here today, Elie, the Ashkenazic Orthodox community has not found really an adequate way to free the aguna when the husband refuses to give the get. What's the practice within Sephardic Judaism?
It is a less of a problem in the Sephardic community, much less of a problem, because the Sephardic community is very much close-knit, so to speak. There is a sense of accountability and there is a sense of belonging. And a man who refuses to give a get to his wife would be frowned about by the rest of the community. If not fully ostracized, but there will be communal pressure, a strong, strong pressure that he will be forced to give that get. So because of the communal structure, because of the close-knit community, because we all know each other, so to speak, and we put pressure. Sometimes there might be a committee of men who are friends with this person that will tell him, you have to give your wife a get. Not only you have to give her a get, but you have to treat her well financially. And so if we have had one or two cases like this, the longest length, or if I may use that, of maybe year and a half maximum. And
you
that
do
get
not
is
have an
given.
aguna problem, or you did not have one at the Sephardic Synagogue?
No, we did not have one at the Sephardic Synagogue, and I don't know of one that really is a cause célèbre. But we are supportive in principle of this process of Hafka'at Kiddushin, which is dissolving a marriage. We are supportive in principle of that process because it is a Talmudic way, and if it's can be applicable to a situation, yes. I did not mention it because we did not have to reach such a level.
Okay.
But there are many responses again throughout the generations of rabbis that were mafki'in kiddushin. Again, the chief rabbi of Israel have done that few times when he saw that it was necessary and when it was done properly. So again, in principle, we support that process if need be.
Okay. Any idea why it is that in the Ashkenazic rabbinate, this principle is not being exercised?
Again, I think it has to do with the entire environment of the stricter, the better, the more stringent, the more holy. But I do believe that, again, ancient Ashkenazi rabbis may have used that process
Much
in
more,
the past,
yes.
much more. It could be also that the rabbis of today may not feel at that level to be able to dissolve a marriage.
What about conversion, Elie? To what extent do you require halakhic conversion, not only for anybody who would want to be part of your congregation and your community, but how do you view somebody who has been converted by a conservative rabbi or a reform rabbi and then wanted to be part of Safra?
Well, let's talk Safra. Put aside the Syrian community, Syrian Sephardic community for an issue, and I'll speak about it in a minute if we have time. But on a generally speaking, the Sephardic community will not accept a convert or considered to be fully Jew if it's done by a conservative or by a reform Beit Din. However, on a case-by-case basis, if it would be discovered that those rabbis in the mostly conservative, not reform, but mostly conservative movement, if they are kind of conservadox, and we know well that their process is halachic in a sense, then that convert might be accepted by the Sephardic community.
Look, halakha requires mikvah for men and women, and if it's a male, it requires either circumcision or the drawing of a drop of blood. Mm-hmm. If those two things are done, why would a rabbi in the Sephardic tradition care whether it was done under the auspices of a conservative or reform rabbi if the two elements of halakha were part of that conversion?
Well, there's a third element.
Yes.
And the third element is Kabbalat,
study of Torah.
Not just the study, is Kabbalat ol Malchut Shamayim, is acceptance of the yoke of heaven, so to speak, a belief in God, and also the belief that Torah is Misinai.
Yes.
That's divine.
But you were already said to me, you're very, what shall I say, not lenient. You are embracing of Jews who walk into the Sephardic synagogue who may not be there. And you said to me, most are, but you said some are not sometimes, and there's no litmus test for you. So I understand you're supposed to have studied Torah and accepted the Torah, but are you going to make an issue over somebody who has not accepted Torah or has not professed a belief in Torah Misinai, even though they're wanting to live a Jewish life and they've had mikvah and brit milah?
If I may give you an example, probably it will illustrate this better. Somebody who's coming to become a U.S. citizen and somebody who's already a U.S. citizen. The person who is a U.S. citizen, he tells you, I do not believe in the American Constitution, and I don't agree with it. You're not going to yank his American citizenship. An alien who says, I would like to become an American, and you tell him you have to swear allegiance or take an oath to respect the Constitution, he says, no, I really disagree with the Constitution. Would you accept him as an American citizen? The answer is no. Exactly the same here. Unfortunately, that's very similar. A Jew who has been born a Jew, or even if he converted or she converted to become a Jew and they accepted, and later on in life, they're no longer observant, they still considered a Jew, and we are embracing of them. But a person who is not a Jew, who would like to embrace Judaism, then that person has to embrace Judaism to the fullest. And I don't mean to be fully observant, because nobody is 100% observant, but at least in the commitment and in the faith, if I can use that word, believing in God and believing in Torah Misinai. Other than that, if a person, according to tradition, if a person does not believe in God, then does not believe that Torah is divine, then Judaism there is in a sense lacking. There's no commitment and identity with traditional Judaism. What is Judaism all about if it's not the belief in one God and in divine Torah?
So, Elie, I have to ask you, you heard me call it a soap opera. Am I correct? You were the founding rabbi of the Sephardic Synagogue here in Manhattan. You built from a very tiny group of Jews into 600 families. And you heard me describe, look, the synagogue became, under your leadership, one of the bright lights, not only of New York City, but one of the great lights, rabbinic lights, congregational lights of Sephardic Judaism throughout America. And this, it doesn't happen by one person, but the reality is that a rabbi shapes the personality of a synagogue, and you were able to do something extraordinary. And then it began to fall apart. I have heard all kinds of stories. I don't want to tell the stories. I want to hear from your perspective. What happened, incidentally? Is it sad for you?
Well, let me just say one thing. There's no question that the generosity of Mrs. Lily Safra helped tremendously in the growth of the synagogue, because I was given a generous budget to work with. And with a generous budget to work with, then you put your vision and your ideas to work, and they work very, very well. My mission there is to build a congregation but more than just a local congregation, to build a presence of Sephardic Judaism in the United States. There is a glorious communities, and there are glorious communities in Brooklyn, in Queens, in Great Neck, no question about that. But Sephardic Judaism was not at a national level, I have to say. We did not have a seat at the table. Had it not been because of the work that we did at Safra, I would not be sitting here either. So my goal and intention and mission was to bring the Sephardic Jews, the Sephardic Jewish community, to the table of Jewish organizational establishment, to also be part of the daily narrative of Jewish life in the United States, to have a voice, to have a vote, so to speak.
With whom?
With the entire Jewish establishment.
What does that mean?
Well,
where did you not have a vote before?
This Sephardic community was much more subdued in a sense. They themselves did not want to be out there and so well known and so scrutinized. But I believe that it is about time for the Sephardic community. They should have a seat at the table of Jewish organizational level, and that way participate in the dialogue and in the narrative of the Jewish community. Whenever a person speaks of Jewish food, they speak of a gefilte fish and herring and cholent. Nothing is mentioned about Sephardic food. I set up to change that. When a person speaks about a Jew, how a Jew looks, usually they have a little toy that a person with a beard and payas and things like that. I was set to change that. And I wanted our voice to be heard in the halls of power, in the halls of society, here and abroad, because I do believe we Sephardic Jews can contribute significantly to the Jewish dialogue, to halakha, to social issues, to political issues that might differ from the Ashkenazi community. And it will be yet another voice of the spectrum. Mm-hmm. And so that is what my goal was. And I think with God's help, we were able to achieve that.
Okay, and then what happens? Why does it fall apart for you?
It really did not fall apart. It was just a question of approach. It was a question of approach that we disagreed on how to approach the situation, and therefore we went on different ways.
Okay, the only reason I'm asking is it was written about in the Jewish press. And when I say Jewish press, you're in the Jewish Week, you're in the Forward, and there are people who go around telling all kinds of stories, which I believe may either be exaggerated or in some instances wholly inaccurate. So not only did I want to meet you on L'chaim to probe who you are as a rabbi, as a doctor, as a Jew, I also wanted you to have a chance where you thought it was appropriate, only where you think it's appropriate, to sort of set the record straight. Were you making $700,000 a year?
No, I was not.
Okay.
But
why is it written? Why is the Jewish Week and then the Forward picks it up, and now everybody thinks that Elie Abadie was making? Incidentally, if you were making $700,000 a year, you have a right to. But most rabbis don't make $700,000 a year, even in New York City. And they said you wanted a $20 million severance package. Is that true?
I tell you, the only thing I could say about that whole incident is that I'm still in the Upper East Side. I still have many followers.
Well, you're creating a new congregation, as I understand.
We started a new congregation called Manhattan East Synagogue. Okay. I know you did not mention, but I started a school 7 years ago, the Sephardic Academy of Manhattan.
Yes.
Which we started with 23 students. Now we have over 90. And
Where are you located?
We're located on 67th and 2nd, and we are poised to buy a building in the next week or two to close on it, actually, where we will have our elementary school. We already started the elementary school level this year with kindergarten. We're going to first grade next year.
Isn't that fabulous?
And the year after into second grade.
That is unbelievable.
So I would like to focus more on the future than on the past.
Okay. Okay.
And the only thing I could say is they were a wonderful 14, 15 years in that congregation. Mrs. Safra was very generous, I have to say, with all the budget that she allowed me to be able to build what we were able to build. And sometimes, people have different ideas and
Okay.
they split. And it is unfortunate that it went into the media, but you're a man of the media, and you know that the media, sometimes they love these sensational things.
Absolutely. No,
The only thing I could say is that, thank God, each one, is growing in a different direction and different ways. And continuing to work for the community. Many of the same people come to me, go there. My most important focus when all of that was happening is to maintain the community intact. And there's a difference maybe between the Ashkenazi and the Sephardic community, where an Ashkenazi community is congregational based, where the Sephardic community is community based. And so it could be 3, 4, 5 congregations, but it's one community.
Lovely.
Where in the Ashkenazi community, usually it's one community
Absolutely.
per congregation.
Yes.
And so my whole intention during that entire debacle, if you want to call it, was to maintain the community united. And it doesn't matter if I'm the rabbi in this synagogue or in another synagogue, I want to maintain the community.
Yes.
And thank God we succeeded in doing that.
Yes.
The same people who are going to the Sephardic Synagogue, they're putting their children into the Sephardic Academy of Manhattan, and now we're also building a community center, the Moïse Safra Community Center on 82nd Street, which was also one of my projects that I started. And it's under construction. Mm-hmm. So the community remains united in that sense.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Was the Sephardic Synagogue your first synagogue?
No.
Okay. So you've had experience with synagogues. There are boards, there are people with power, there are people with money, everybody's your boss, they all tell you what to do. There's rivalry, there's jealousy. If you could shape or define the ideal relationship, nothing's ideal in life, but still. You talked about derech eretz that your father taught you. If you could define a relationship between congregation and rabbi that embodied derech eretz both ways, what would it be that isn't, at the moment, typical in synagogue congregational life with the rabbi as you know it firsthand and because you know it from other rabbis?
Let me just make a few comments, and then probably we'll get to that answer. First, one of the reasons that my father taught me, and probably why many of the Sephardic ancestors believe that a rabbi should have a job or a profession outside the rabbinate, is to be financially independent. So that to me is
Number one.
Number one. And that's how I lived my life. And that's why all what I have experienced in the rabbinate, as many other rabbis experienced, I just shrug it off, because thank God financial independence I had from medicine. In fact, before I came to the Sephardic Synagogue, 75% of my income was medical and 25% was rabbinic. And I believe that is a very, very important ingredient, because it gives the rabbi the freedom to speak his mind and the truth. And I am known to do so without being afraid of anything, because I believe a rabbi ought to speak his mind, because he is a leader. He's supposed to speak his mind and not to be afraid and look back. We're not politicians. We don't need to follow polls. We need to follow our conscience. And so that's one of the most important reasons to have another profession where I'm earning a living, so I could speak my mind. So if every rabbi would have that, then the board would respect them. I have to say that I experienced personally a respect from boards when they see they're talking to a doctor, they're talking to a director of a educational institution, a founder of an educational is no longer an employee. And so if that is possible, that every rabbi could have another source of income, that probably will balance the power between the rabbi and the board. And also board need to understand that they have to take the rabbi and see with reverence, with respect, and see him as the leader of the community. Unfortunately, that's not the case in many of the communities, except maybe in the ultra-Orthodox communities, where the rabbi is the leader. But in all the other communities, the president is the leader or the board is the leader. And those leaders change because there are elections. And even those leaders, they create certain enemies at the end. And so therefore you don't have a continuity. But the rabbi will remain always there unless he has a fight with the community board and he's no longer there. But to be able to respond to that is basically an independent source of income for a person is very, very important. But that is a problem that I have seen with many of my colleagues. Sephardic and Ashkenazi makes no difference, unfortunately. Though many Ashkenazi people tell me that Sephardic congregants have much more reverence and respect for the rabbis than Ashkenazi congregation. That might be the case. And I think it's because they see in the rabbi as a leader, as a sage, as somebody who's going to help them spiritually and not just a position to be filled in a synagogue. He's a religious leader. Then I always think of Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. How can I complain if I'm not getting along with my board or with one of my congregants? If Moses himself had so many complaints against him, if he, who spoke to God, who brought the word of God to the people and they saw it with their own eyes, he was attacked and he complains against him, who am I to complain about that myself and to say, please God help me? And so I take all of those things as part of the job, part of the responsibilities. Thank God I'm able to speak to the people, and if there's any differences, we try to sort them out. And we always agree to disagree at the end of the day. But many people on the board sometimes either they like to impose their power, their ideas, so on and so forth. That might be a personal issue. You know, a joke is always made by the rabbis that usually men are the ones who are on boards, at least in the traditional synagogues. We say that's because at home they're not the boss. They come here to be the bosses.
Your insight that if a rabbi is not dependent economically for survival on his congregation, the dynamic between the congregation and the rabbi is totally different. The rabbi's freedom is totally different. And there are many courageous rabbis, by the way. I'm not suggesting there are many. Say whatever they believe is true and don't worry about the consequences. But very, very often now, especially in these turbulent times, there are rabbis who won't talk about things on the pulpit. There are rabbis who, depending on where their congregation is, they will or will not talk about Israel. And if they do talk about Israel, it has to be the party line, even if they don't believe in the party line. And if they don't believe in the party line, then they won't talk at all. And they won't talk about conversion. They won't talk about intermarriage. They won't talk about all the issues which are critical to the Jewish future, because although you say they're not politicians, and we all know rabbis are not politicians, there's a political component now if you are dependent upon the congregation to feed you and to house you and to make sure you have money to send your kids to school. And so what you're saying is, I believe you're 1,000% correct. I believe that I've been very lucky. I share very little with you because I am so flattered you're here.
Thank you.
But I am able to share that with you, that I have had the good fortune to always be involved in media work and my congregational work, which I love, I adore. I couldn't imagine not being with my chavarot. But I'm not, if for some reason they didn't want me anymore, I would not be economically bereft. It changes the way a rabbi operates, yes?
100%. 100%. It's so true. The independence of the rabbis' speeches, and sometimes my congregants, when I speak, and I tell my congregants out there, says, this is my pulpit, and I'm speaking my mind. You may disagree with what I have to say. When it is your pulpit, you could speak your mind. We could discuss it after, not during the sermon. And in a very pleasant way. And my congregants accept it. They understand. They understand this is your pulpit, Rabbi, and it's my turn to speak. You may disagree with me, but this is my conscience.
I am very happy for you, and I think you're 100% correct.
Time is a presentation of Jewish Education in Media.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS, the Jewish Broadcasting Service, with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double chai or more, to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media. Simply visit the JBS homepage and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check made out to Jem, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York 10471. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. And we thank you for your kind support.